Hello everyone, it's Mark Kodaka here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 44, and today I'm going to be asking, what did Paul think of Jesus? It's one of those things that people sometimes say about Paul, that he had no interest at all in the earthly Jesus, that is, the Jesus before the resurrection, that his whole picture of Jesus was solely based on the idea of the crucified Christ, the crucified and resurrected Jesus, that what he did was he had his whole system worked out based on the idea of this crucified, risen Jesus. And he was so obsessed with this character and so obsessed with seeing Jesus in that way that he really didn't have any time to dwell on what Jesus was actually like in his lifetime. The Jesus from Nazareth, the Jesus who had a Mother Mary and who had brothers and sisters and who had a career and all these sorts of things, that Paul was simply uninterested in that character and therefore doesn't ever talk about him. The thing is, there are some things that are actually right about that view. I mean, if you only had Paul's epistles, you would actually be unbelievably weaker in your knowledge about the historical Jesus. I mean, Paul doesn't ever mention that Jesus lived in Nazareth. He doesn't mention that Jesus was someone who worked with his hands as a carpenter or something else. He doesn't dwell on things like Jesus's parables. I mean, when you read the Gospels, you see, page after page, all these amazing parables, and Paul never says, as Jesus said when he was telling the parable of the Good Samaritan, or as Jesus said when he told the parable of the sower. He never says anything like that. So you would be a great deal weaker. I mean, he doesn't really talk about things like Jesus's miracle working at all. So, I'm not in any sense in this podcast denying that Paul, if we only had Paul, would give you a much weaker view of what the historical Jesus was like, and you would have many fewer details reported about his life. But I think it's one of those things where you can really exaggerate the extent of Paul's lack of interest or supposed lack of interest in this topic, because actually I think when you spend a bit of time with his epistles, it's remarkable how much Jesus tradition there is in them, and I'd like to kind of explore that in a little bit more detail. So if we take, for example, 1 Corinthians, Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, I've noticed incidentally that this is a real difference between Americans and Brits when they're talking about these things. Brits will tend to say 1 Corinthians, Americans will say 1 Corinthians, and as a Brit living and working in America, I have a bit of an identity crisis about this. But anyway, I'll say 1 Corinthians for now. In 1 Corinthians, you find several times where Paul will actually pick out a piece of Jesus' tradition, a piece of material that's clearly derived from his knowledge of what Jesus did. The first really clear example of this comes in 1 Corinthians 7. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul is dealing with issues connected with sexual ethics and with relationships and things like this, and inevitably he gets to the topic of divorce and remarriage. And here's what he says in that context. In verses 10 and 11 of 1 Corinthians 7, he says, "To the married I give this command, not I but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does separate, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife." It's fascinating that Paul gives this as a command of the Lord, and he gives it as something that trumps any advice that he might give himself. And those that say that Paul isn't really interested in the Jesus tradition or in what Jesus said really hasn't taken seriously what's going on here in 1 Corinthians 7, which is that where Paul knows something that Jesus has said, or that Jesus is reported to have said, he will bring that forward as something that settles the matter. There's this thing that contemporary evangelical preachers say where they'll say, the Bible says it, and therefore I believe it. And for Paul, that's probably true here where it comes to things he's heard Jesus said. Jesus has said it, and so he believes it. And he just trots it out, and he says, this is a command of the Lord. So that's really striking. And when you go back to the Gospels, you'll notice that this is a command of Jesus that comes lots. You get it twice in Matthew in chapter 5 and chapter 18. You get it once in Mark in chapter 10. You get it once in Luke in chapter 16. So it is something that you get lots of times in the Gospels, which come, of course, later than Paul's epistles, but seem to report this same tradition that you get in Paul. The thing is, it's not an isolated example either, this business from 1 Corinthians 7, because if you just follow a little bit later in 1 Corinthians, there's another really interesting case of Paul giving you a commandment that Jesus has himself given. And that's in 1 Corinthians 9, where Paul is here defending himself against the charge that he has not received any kind of remuneration for his preaching of the gospel. And in doing this, he and Barnabas are contrasted to other people who are, when they preach the gospel, getting their living from the gospel. And those people who preach and then take some kind of donation, some kind of financial support, some food and drink from the local communities that he's preaching. And Paul's a bit annoyed here because he's been working with his hands so as not to burden the Corinthians, and then he's getting criticized for it as well. But his defense against this is fascinating, because not only does he at the beginning of the chapter confirm that Jesus's brothers were ones that engaged in this activity of receiving money from those that they preach to, and Peter too, he mentions, and also these characters took with them wives with them on their journeys, which Paul by implication didn't. But in addition to those things, he then adds that Jesus himself commanded that the one who preaches the gospel should get their living by the gospel in verse 14 of that chapter. And the thing which is fascinating here is that this isn't something that Paul himself has been observing. So he knows of a command of Jesus that contrasts of it with his own action. And I always feel a bit sorry for Paul here, because he's the one that's been, slogging his guts out, working hard to try and preach the gospel to the Corinthians without receiving any kind of financial benefit from it, and then he's getting criticized for it as well. And he's got his work cut out. What he actually does in this chapter is he says, yes, I know that this is a right, but it's a right that I didn't make use of. I didn't claim that right to financial remuneration. But for the purposes of knowing that Paul actually was familiar with Jesus' tradition, it's a really interesting chapter, because it shows that Paul knew a lot more of the sayings of Jesus than we might have imagined. And it doesn't stop there. A couple of chapters later in 1 Corinthians, you have the earliest version of the Eucharistic tradition, Paul sharing with the Corinthians his knowledge of the tradition of the Eucharist. So what's happened is the Corinthians have been arguing over the whole business of the Eucharist, and Paul's kind of annoyed about this and speaks into the situation of the conflict in Corinth by reminding them of the tradition that they've all received. And he begins, in the night that he was handed over, Jesus took bread. And it's fascinating, that introductory line when he starts quoting the Eucharistic tradition, because he says, in the night Jesus was handed over, as if he's quoting something that the Corinthians were already familiar with. He's quoting something that they actually know as a continuous narrative. So I think it's something which reveals to us that there is something broader that Paul is just tapping into here. And a careful reading of Paul's epistles confirms that it isn't just these elements that you get. I mean, you can see things if you look carefully, things that Paul just drops in passing. I mean, look at 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul lists a whole bunch of people who are witnesses to the resurrection. One of the things that's interesting there is that Paul mentions an appearance to the 12, and you think, so he knows about the 12. And he's not making a big deal about it. He's not saying, and Jesus called 12 disciples, and this shows that there were 12 disciples who were standing for the 12 tribes of Israel, or anything like that. It's just a term that he just drops in as if everybody knows it. And I think that, again, what it suggests is that Paul is drawing from a larger stock of shared knowledge of Jesus' tradition. Of course, one of the difficulties with this is that when you look at something like 1 Corinthians, it reminds you that you only can see Jesus' tradition in Paul where he needs to mention it. And this is the problem, of course, always at looking at Paul. And we have to remind ourselves that these letters are occasional, they're contingent, they're written to particular communities at particular times about particular topics. So we happen to find out about Paul's knowledge of Jesus on divorce because he was telling the Corinthians about it. We happen to find out that he knew the Eucharistic tradition because he happened to have a problem in Corinth about the Eucharist, and so on. And maybe if one of his other communities had some great big issue about some other area in Jesus's mission that was relevant to the topic, maybe he would have mentioned that too. I mean, it's curious that when you look at 1 Thessalonians, for example, he does mention something by word of the Lord, which relates very closely to teaching that Jesus gives in Matthew 24 and parallels about the eschaton. So where Paul is dealing with the eschaton, with the end times, with the parousia, the second coming of Jesus in 1 Thessalonians, he finds himself repeating something that sounds again like the Jesus tradition that you see in Matthew and Matthew 24 and parallels. So I think quite often it's the case that we only find stuff out where Paul needs to speak about that particular topic to his communities. There is a curiosity that's worth bringing up as well here, though, and that's that Paul seems much more willing to bring up Jesus' tradition earlier in his letter writing phases than later. I take 1 Corinthians as one of Paul's earlier letters. I think it clearly dates before Galatians, and I think the only letter that's earlier than it is 1 Thessalonians. And the thing is, surely it's no coincidence that 1 Thessalonians and 1 Corinthians are the two letters that have most of this Jesus tradition in. I suspect, and this is only a hunch, but I suspect that Paul was a little more willing to use Jesus tradition in his letters at this slightly earlier point in his career, because at a later point where he has had a little bit more kind of conflict with Jerusalem and the apostles there, when he's had a bit more conflict with them, I think he is a little more reticent to bring forward Jesus' tradition, because of course people like Peter really knew Jesus and really were able to bring forward a lot more of that tradition, and Paul has to be a little bit careful about bringing that material forward a bit later in his career after he's been in some serious situations of conflict with them there. That's kind of my hunch. The reason that he slightly changes tack when it comes to Galatians, which I put after 1 Corinthians, and also 2 Corinthians and so on, he's just a little more reticent. But even then, and if you read the epistle to the Romans, you do see even there in one of Paul's latest epistles, even though he doesn't explicitly quote Jesus, you see material that reminds you of the Gospels quite a bit. And I suspect that that's the same thing that Paul has learnt about Jesus from those who were apostles before him. And after all, C.H. Dodd said that when Paul spent time with Peter early on, not long after his conversion, 3 years after his conversion, that they wouldn't just have been talking about the weather. And we know about this trip that Paul had to Jerusalem after 3 years. He mentions it in Galatians 1. What was Paul talking to Peter about all that time? Of course he was talking about Jesus and about the Jesus tradition. And bear in mind also that some of the people that were Paul's travelling companions for years were from Jerusalem and knew the Jerusalem community and so on, so would also have known some of this material. Barnabas, that Paul travels with, was, according to Acts of the Apostles, someone that was based in Jerusalem for much of his time, and Silas, who he travels with later, is someone who comes from Jerusalem. So my guess is that Paul is mixing with people that knew this stuff, and so of course he has much more of a knowledge of the Jesus tradition than you might first realise when you look more superficially at his epistles. Well, thanks for listening to the latest episode of the NT Pod. It's always good to have your company. You can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com, on Facebook at ntpod, on twitter.com at ntpod again, or of course on iTunes or Duke University's iTunes U. Be along again soon with another episode, I hope, and I look forward to your company then. Bye-bye.